Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about proposals. What I mean by this is proposals that are sometimes called abstract. Those aren't necessarily the same thing, but if you are, for instance, proposing a paper for a conference, or if you have to do a proposal before, say, a major project for a class or something like this, if you're doing a book proposal, those are going to be slightly more in depth, but the basic elements of the written proposal portion will still typically apply here. This is not things like grant proposals. Stuff like that is more technical. There are specific steps and often specific elements that you need to include. So what I'm really talking, and this is also not proposal essays. That's a particular category of papers, of essays that you will sometimes be called upon to write. This is not those. What I'm talking about is the relatively short, usually between 200 and 500 word long, um, basically mini glosses of an essay that you give to someone in order to convince them to accept it for something. Again, one of the most common elements of this, for one of the most common reasons you would write a proposal for scholars, is conference proposals. I've written dozens of conference proposals over the time I've been in academia. Um, and there are particular things that you want to make sure that you include. So I'm going to show you two of them, two that I've written. Both are from. Nope, that's not one. All right, I want you and I want you. So both of these are for humanities papers. Um, this one I wrote for the Comparative Drama Conference in 2024, called Death of Innocence, Agonistic Conflict and Ethics in Sophocles' Antigone and Guan Hanjing's Snow in Midsummer. The other I wrote, I think, for I want to say the CEA conference, the College English Association conference, back in, I don't know, 2015, 2014, somewhere in there, a while back. Anyway, it's called Visiting Grandmother, a question about the ethics of the friendly teaching persona. So these are two very different topics, but they're both humanities oriented. They're both literary, philosophical, etc., etc. That's my particular style as a scholar. But that is not the point. The point here is I'm going to take you through the components of what should be in this type of proposal and how I tend to organize them, which is not necessarily the only way of organizing them. But you should have these components in some order within your abstract. So let's start with this one, Visiting Grandmother, a question about the ethics of the friendly teaching persona. And we start with the first paragraph of this. In an interview on Nightbeat, the philosopher Slavoj Žižek explained his idea about the authority of the good old-fashioned totalitarian father compared to the so-called tolerant postmodern father. Žižek claimed that the totalitarian father will command his child to go to grandmother's house and behave properly there. This allows the child to resist, complying without wanting to go. On the other hand, the postmodern father tells the child only to go to grandmother's if he or she genuinely wants to go. I got a grammar mechanics error there. Grandmothers should have an apostrophe. Anyway, but adds that you know how much your grandmother loves you. With the postmodern father, Žižek argued the child is not a criminal for refusing to go to the grandmother's house. The child is a criminal for not wanting to go to grandmother's house. So what is this first paragraph now? This is actually not about teaching at all, right? This is about parenting and a particular philosopher's conception of parenting. But this introduces the critical lens through which I am looking at the material. So this is one crucial element of a proposal like this. What philosophical, critical, theoretical issue are you engaged with, or lens are you utilizing? How are you looking at the material that you're looking at? That's something that you need to include, because that establishes that establishes the context in which your argument is taking place. So what framework are you using to say something about your content? So if we take a look at the second paragraph, the paper is intended to reflect on the subtle ways in which we continue to exercise a totalitarian-esque authority in the classroom, even as we strive to reduce the power imbalance by so many composition theorists have argued is harmful to student learning. I will draw on Zizek's Lacanian psychoanalytic theory, some composition theorists, for instance, Leanne Carroll, Marshall W. Gregory, and Susan Miller, and my own classroom experiences to raise questions about the ethics of different modes of classroom authority. The main issue I'm interested in tangling with is how a friendly teaching ethos may, rather than reducing our authority in the classroom, merely mask it in a different form, but leave intact our power to judge and punish. This is the central focus of the project, right? So by the end of this, the main issue I'm interested in tangling with is, by that sentence, we're getting to the actual argument being made in the paper. That's absolutely crucial. You need to have a version of your thesis within that proposal. This paragraph also gives us additional context for understanding the argument that's going to be made, because the paper itself, again, is about teaching, about modes of classroom personas. And so we go from here's Zizek's conception of power and how power functions to power functions within the classroom. I'm interested in how. So again, we've got the broad scale theoretical framework being set up. Then we've got a more focused theoretical framework being set up. So power, teaching, here is my question. And then this third paragraph takes us into new territory. As a new composition instructor, I've been trained now at the University of Vermont and West Virginia University to develop personal relationships with my students, to show them that I too am a person and to be friendly but not friends. In light of Zizek's claims, I begin to question whether my own classroom authority does not rely, like the postmodern fathers, on an apparent free choice used to exercise authority. I see this working through two classroom components: the importance of the skills I'm trying to teach and the necessity of grading students. Because most of my composition students are non-English majors, I constantly emphasize the way the skills I'm teaching can benefit them in other university classes, which perhaps suggests to my students that they should work hard in my class only for themselves, which is true in a sense. The insidious component of this is that when students do poorly in my class, they have failed themselves, and I bear little or no responsibility as the instructor. The other component that complicates the personal or friendly ethos is grading, which is a throwback to a semi-totalitarian system of valuing work, i.e. valuing students, based on a set of criteria. So what this paragraph does, it does give a little bit of context about me. That's not crucial necessarily, though in some fields and some disciplines, particularly things like feminism, identifying your own position as a speaker is regarded as an important component of critical work. But it's not absolutely necessary in all instances for writing an effective proposal. But what this paragraph basically is doing is giving a mini version of my argument. So this is the other thing that you want. You want a specific summary, a gloss of the argument that you're going to be making. So we got three major components here. You need to establish the theoretical framework. You need to give us a thesis, and you need to give us a summary of the argument itself. The other thing that is not specifically developed here, but that actually is really important, is an explanation of why this matters. What are the stakes for this? Here we have this implicit in the word, in the sort of third paragraph primarily, but second paragraph a little bit. What's implicit is that you can fairly assume that people interested in teaching are interested in teaching well and are interested in teaching fairly. So that's sort of central here. But those are really the four major components, I'd say. So I don't care about that. So let's take a look at this one, because this is actually a much more recent proposal. The other one, probably a decade or so old. This one is from this year. So hopefully by this point, I'm a bit better at this. But again, this is Death of Innocence, Agonistic Conflict and Ethics in Sophocles' Antigone and Guanhanjing, Snow in Midsummer. One of the things that you'll notice is I really like starting with the theoretical framework. So I do the same thing here. W.G.F. Hegel famously identified 5th century BCE Athenian playwright Sophocles' Antigone as the prime example of agonistic conflict, a tragic structure in which two valid conflicting ethical positions confront one another. Hegel analyzes the conflict between Antigone and Creon. This is the background. Now I start to get into my own position, right? So Hegel's analysis of agonistic conflict, that is the theoretical framework that I'm going to be working with. Now I'm starting to challenge it. However, Antigone also faces an agonistic conflict within herself. Ismene presents arguments in favor of feminine submission to authority, so Antigone is clearly aware of this position, and yet she maintains that her duty to the dead is supreme. I've now got a paragraph break here, in part because I'm switching topics between the two plays that I'm discussing. So this isn't necessarily a new idea in the way that the previous proposal moved through new ideas. This is the comparative element of the argument I'm making. In Snow in Midsummer, by 13th to 14th century Chinese playwright Guanhanjing, the heroine Duo Yi faces a similar ethical decision. When her guardian, Granny Kai, is blackmailed into a second marriage in violation of Confucian tradition, Duo Yi refuses to marry the blackmailer's son, even though Kai presents pragmatic arguments for doing so. Duo Yi is executed for a crime she didn't commit because she remains true to her Confucian values. So part of what I've done here, I've given a little bit of summary of Antigone, but I've given more summary of Snow in Midsummer, partially because it's less familiar to Western audiences, and most of the people reading the proposals for the comparative drama conference, even though they are drama people and there's a very good chance they're familiar with this play, it's probably not one that most Western scholars are reading and thinking about all the time. So that's part of the thing there. But then it's really in this last paragraph that I jam together all of the major components you really want in an effective proposal. Both Antigone and Duo Yi face an agonistic choice, with ethical responsibilities pulling them in contradictory directions, and yet both remain steadfast in their moral convictions, facing death to remain unsullied. I argue that this comparable plotline, separated by centuries and from very different cultures, reflects a common thread in the social disciplining of women, internalization of guilt. I argue that both Antigone and Duo Yi submit to their unjust deaths, in part because patriarchal societies condition women to accept even unfounded guilt. Ismene argues that Antigone has violated Hellenic gender norms of submission, and Granny Kai argues that Duo Yi should honor her by submitting to the marriage. Both protagonists are stuck between an ethical rock and a moral hard place. Either decision is taboo. Therefore, within Greek and Chinese patriarchal worldviews, Antigone and Duo Yi are inherently guilty and deserving of punishment. So, how does this work? Well, I'm giving the central argument that I'm making, We have a version of a thesis here. I argue that this comparable plotline reflects a common trend in the social disciplining of women, internalization of guilt. But we've also got claim, sort of smaller scale level claims developed. Both Antigone and Dwoe face an agonistic choice with ethical responsibilities pulling them in contradictory directions, and yet both remain steadfast in their moral convictions, facing death to remain unsullied. I have to support both of those arguments within the paper itself, and I've given very, very brief explanations of how those things work within this proposal itself. But then I've also set the stakes for this. The idea of the social disciplining of women inherently has a set of stakes because it deals with how societies function, how patriarchy functions, and also deals with the possibilities and limitations facing individuals within a society. So those are really the crucial sort of key elements of an effective proposal. You want to make sure that you have a version of your thesis. It may not be the final thesis. If you are writing this and you haven't yet written the paper, which is very, very common for scholars, but you want a version of the thesis. This is the major argument I plan to make. You want a summary of the argument, the overall argument that you're presenting. Here are the key points. Maybe here's some of the evidence, depending on how many words you have. You want to set up a theoretical framework. Here is how I'm looking at this information. Here's maybe the philosophical positions, the critical theorists who are informing my argument, whatever it is. And then you want the stakes. Why does this matter? What's important about the argument that I'm making here? How you choose to set those four things up is really up to you. Again, I personally like starting with the philosophical or theoretical framework, but that's not necessarily the norm. Definitely, that's not something everybody does. But you want to have all of those components. Your central argument, summary of main points, critical framework, and stakes, explanation of why it matters.